Thank you for joining today. We're going to talk a bit about how we can make our web servers more secure and more available using some of the open standards that are out there right now. As Aisha mentioned, my name is Dan York. I'm responsible for a lot of our online content across the Internet Society's various different websites. We operate www.internetsociety.org, but also a wide range of other websites. And we focus a lot on how we make those sites available to everyone, everywhere. Last year in 2020, I also led a project called the Open Standards Everywhere Project, or OSE project. And we'll be talking about the materials of that project during this time. The objective of this really is to help you understand how to make your chapter websites more available and more secure using some of the open internet standards that are out there in different ways. We're also going to help you improve a score with a site we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. I want to begin by saying a bit about what the Open Standards Everywhere project was. It was something we did during 2020. It is a project that we developed a set of this materials. And our focus really is around how do we help use open standards? And they are a fundamental building block, right? If you think of all of the different standards that are out there, we use these on a daily basis. They're part of what we use. We're connecting right now over HTTP and HTTPS. These are things we're using. IP, TCP, UDP, all of these things are protocols we're using at this moment to have this connection in some way. These standards are open to everybody to read, open to everybody to use. They're free. We don't have to pay anybody. We don't have to ask any permission. We don't have to do any of this to use these standards that are part of it. They're also a core part of what we call at the Internet Society, the Internet way of networking. They're part of a critical property that we talk about with the IWN, or the Internet way of networking. So we want these open standards to be everywhere. In this conversation, we're going to talk about today are some of the key ones around security-wise, DNSSEC, TLS. We'll talk a bit more about these, IPv6, HTTP2, some of these are there. One of the tools we're going to use to be able to see how well our websites work is a site called Internet.nl. It is a site that is maintained by an organization called NLNet Labs, which is based in the Netherlands. And the Internet Society Netherlands chapter and many others have been involved with helping this site go. And you're welcome to go right now. If you just go to Internet.nl, you can go there and you can enter in your chapter website, your own website, whichever you'd like to do. But for this purpose, we're talking primarily about your chapter or SIG website. And it will go and give you a test. It'll run through the test. If you go there, there's a part where it says test your website. You can just enter in your URL there, and it will come back to you with a score. It'll say, how well is your site using the latest standards for security and availability? There's also another site called http2.pro, which is for testing for HTTP version 2, and we'll talk a bit about that later. But the main one would be, if you take a look at that, you may find that your chapter's website does great. And if it does, fantastic. You can take some of this information and look around how to do more. But you may also find that it's not doing so well. And what we're going to talk about here are some ways you can help improve that score and help make your website more secure, and doing that based on open standards. So I should say this project, the pieces, the information that you have there is really focused around the basic level of where you're at, of the basic connection, of the way that you connect from the web browser to the web server. We're looking at HTTP, we're looking at DNS, TLS, all of the pieces that are down there below the connection. So that's what we're talking about here when we look at how do we secure our web servers. We're looking at the network layer, really that part of things. We're not going to get so much into what happens above that. Each of you operate your website using some website service. You might be using something like WordPress. You might use another hosting provider. You might be writing it all in HTML. You might be doing, something in some way. There's many ways that you can go and secure those systems. We're not going to talk about that specifically. We're going to talk about how do we make the connections to the web servers as secure as possible. So let's look at this. The materials coming out of the Open Standards Everywhere project, which are available to you all as chapters, but also to the public. We created some reference servers that allow you to see what would it look like if you did something right. If you were to go and use that Internet.nl test site, what does a 100% server look like? You can use it, you can connect to it, you can test it, you can work with that. And then we also documented our materials, which are available, we'll talk about. And then we also have had an ongoing effort to make our own websites as secure as possible. There are reference servers out here. The URLs are available here, but you don't need to go to these directly as much, but they're here and they're linked from the documentation. You can go and take a look and use these to try different commands against them and see how they work. This is the main key point, is on this website, which we're using GitHub as a place to store this information. We've been developing it publicly there. You can go to this site and you'll see the documentation as we've developed it thus far. And you can be able to go and read that documentation, work with it. Right now, it's all in English. We will be translating it into French and Spanish, but it's there and you can use that, promote it. If those help you in working with the different materials, you can do all this. So it's out there and we'll come back to that later in the session as well. On our own, we have been working on how do we practice what we promote. If we're promoting security, if we tell people that we want to use encryption, that we want to have secure websites, we as the Internet Society ought to do that as well. So we've audited all of our corporate websites and we've been working on changes. This was a chart of what it looked like when we began. Today, we've actually moved almost all of our corporate web servers up to, actually we have a 93% across all of our different websites. So we've moved most all of our servers to having very high internet.nl scores by virtue of working on them. We've gone and made sure that they're all available over IPv6. They're all using HTTPS, DNSSEC, all of these different things. It's taken a good bit of work for us to get there, but we're at a very high percentage now, and we've just got a bit more to go to close it to get them even higher. And that's part of what we're trying to do. And we're providing this session to help all of you help us go and reach that percentage even more and be able to get higher in that. Even though the Open Standards Everywhere project was something we did in 2020 and is not being fully promoted during 2021, we are continuing watching to see what other standards are evolving and how we can help with that. There's one in particular we're watching called HTTP3. There's a protocol called QUIC, which makes access to web servers even faster and more secure. And that's coming along as something HTTP3. That's something coming, we think, sometime here in 2021. It's the IETF standards process and it's moving along. But as that goes, we will also be making it available and helping people understand how they can move their web servers to this as fast as possible. Let me just pause there before I get into things. Any major questions before we move along?
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering about the standards that you have presented. All of them are network protocols. But regarding the content, the thing that you mentioned that above that, you won't go into details, but for example, W3C, the body standardization behind all the web technologies, HTML5, CSS3, and not only the text part, but then also a little bit of the programming part. If you put all the bits and pieces regarding JavaScript and so on, is there any guidelines for the Internet Society regarding how to implement or use these technologies?
Good question. This is why we scoped it to be only on the connectivity side, on really the internet, the lower network connections of network architecture, because there's so many different ways that you could do those higher level, the security there and the pieces there. I can certainly provide some guidelines. And we have some out there around what you should be thinking about, how you should be looking at how you secure your servers in different ways. So yes, there are some guidelines we can provide. It's not part of what we'll be talking about directly today in that regard, but we can provide some of that.
Because
I also see Willie had a question about QUIC and was it developed by Google? Google was one of the people who developed the original protocols, something called Speedy that evolved on into HTTP2 and then on into QUIC and some of the pieces that are out there. It's now been in the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, for the last couple of years here, working through a process to come out. QUIC is already heavily used by web browsers and servers around the internet, but we're waiting until it is formally announced as the HTTP3 standard. It's nearing the end in the IETF process, so we'll see about that. So let me talk a bit about what we're looking at for web servers and the way that some of this information is worded and in doing that. In this documentation that you'll see, there's 3 types of servers that we're going to be talking about in here. Some of those are the traditional kind of web server that you might host, that you're self-hosted, that you're running an actual server in a data center. It might be somebody's university or business or whatever else, or you're running it in a virtual machine. It might be hosted with a web hosting provider where you're using them as the location, and this is very common. And you don't necessarily have access in there to go and change some of the files. A lot of the documentation we developed, specifically talks about how you can make changes in a self-hosted environment, because that's where you can make the most changes. But obviously hosting is another one. And the third is using a content delivery network, or CDN. And that's typically a service that you use in front of your website. And we're going to actually talk a little bit about that in a moment, just to explain a bit about that. But you'll see these 3 different things. If you're using a hosting provider, very often you don't have a whole lot of control over what you can do for your web. There'll be changes here that we talk about. And really, often with the hosting providers, unfortunately, the most you can do is raise technical support tickets. Now, I will tell you, this is actually the best thing you can do, because if you're on a hosting provider, sometimes the hosting providers will not implement changes until their customers ask. So if you're using a hosted service, the best thing I can say is raise those support tickets, send them email, do that things. We had somebody who was saying, we're not going to implement TLS 1.3 because nobody's doing it, type of thing. When they started to get support tickets from multiple customers saying, we'd like to have TLS 1.3, sooner or later, they were like, okay, we're getting enough support calls. We ought to go and do this. They can't say nobody's asking for it, which is a typical thing that they often will say before. You also now can point them to the OSE documentation and say, hey, could you go and make these changes, please? We'd like to see that. If you can't do that, then you have a choice. You can stay there and not be as secure as you'd like, or you can look at moving to another hosting provider. Your options are somewhat limited there. I do want to talk a bit, just mention about content delivery networks. In a typical environment, when you have a website, whether it's self-hosted or whether it's with a hosting provider, it works on its own web server and people connect to it from across the internet. And this is how the web has worked since it began in the early 1990s. It's worked this way in some way. The challenge, of course, can be that web server can get very overwhelmed. Your site could have a ton of people connecting to it, and it could slow down. It could even go offline with the amount of traffic that's there. So what's happened over the years is the emergence of what are called content delivery networks, or some people may call them content distribution networks. And they are networks where what you do is when you connect with your web browser, you aren't actually connecting to the original web server. You don't actually connect to it. When you go to www.internetsociety.org, you're not coming to the actual server that we use that is hosted in a data center somewhere. You don't do that. Instead, in the case of the Internet Society, we use Cloudflare. And so you're actually connecting to one of Cloudflare's what are called edge servers that are out there in the internet somewhere. Whichever one you connect to will be wherever you are from the network topography, where you're closest to. What's the connection? Given that a good number of you I see are coming in from places across Asia Pacific, you might be hitting connections, edge servers that are in places it could be in Singapore or Sydney or New Delhi, or who knows, they could be anywhere across the entire region. Wherever you are closest to the network, you're connecting there. You're getting a copy of our website, but it's coming through those systems that are there. So these are the CDNs, content delivery networks, that are out there. The interesting part, and the reason why I suggest there's something for chapters to look at, is because of the fact that they allow you to take your content and get it out there on the edge, out there to these different places, these caching networks, basically across the internet, so that people can get to your content as fast as possible. CDNs also make it possible that you can have things like TLS or TLS 1.3 or DNSSEC or IPv6 or things like that you may not have in your original, what's called an origin server, your original server. You may not have those. I have this for my own websites. I have a number of sites that are hosted with a provider that I've had them there since the 1990s in some cases. And the provider just has not moved, and I haven't had the energy to move some of these, and they don't support some of the newer protocols and most secure things. But I use a content delivery network in front of them, which provides the security and the availability for those different sites. So it's something to take a look at. There are also CDNs originated really with looking at how you can improve your speed. And speed is certainly important, especially these days where search engines like Google are prioritizing sites. Starting in May, they'll be prioritizing sites that have the higher performance around it. They can help with that. There are some CDNs that offer free services, others that you pay a commercial part to it in some way. There's a lot of them that are out there in various different ways. So there's something to investigate that you can find and see what's available out there in some way. If you use just one note, and a little bit of a geeky note in this regard, but often the CDNs work by redirecting your DNS. They do that because when you go to www.internetsociety.org, you're being redirected to the closest, in this case, Cloudflare server. We've previously used other servers. We used Amazon's CloudFront at one point. We also have one site that uses Akamai's CDN. Whoever it is, they're handling the DNS for those servers, so they can work with that. Sometimes you can use what's called a CNAME record, a way to point to where your site is served in some way. So there's a couple of different ways. They may require some DNS configuration to work, but it's something that you can go and look at. Let's talk about TLS. Let's begin this and work with this. TLS is what we used to call SSL. We called it secure socket layer. It's the connection between your web browser and your web server. It's encrypted. It's something on that. This is something we've been aiming to see more of across the internet for the longest time. And people have been using it, but if you hear us talking about TLS, that's the proper name of it. Increasingly, people are calling it that, although some web hosts still talk about it as far as getting SSL certificates and pieces like that. But it's the HTTPS. It's the piece that you see there. Now, one thing that we're looking at when you talk about security, is to ensure your web server only supports the newest versions. By new, it means TLS 1.2 from 2008. So not exactly the newest, but it is in this space, and the newer TLS 1.3. There's two older versions, 1.0 and 1.1, that we actually encourage people to disable, to no longer support. They're not as secure as they used to be. And in fact, actually, they're being removed from browsers and removed from other places. So it's best if you can go and remove those from your web server and have them not work on there. If you have a hosting provider, if you're using a web hosting provider, hopefully they're providing TLS at this point in time. If they're not, this is something they definitely should be. They need it. Google prioritizes in its search rankings sites that have HTTPS connections. They have been doing that since 2015. So most hosting providers are providing that in some way. CDNs support this. If you're doing your own web server, if you're running your own self-hosted server, then you'll need to install some element like that. There's a service called Let's Encrypt, which provides free certificates that you can go and install. And it takes a little bit of configuration to go set that up, but it's something that you can do to get TLS for your websites. It's something that you can consider there. I would encourage all of our chapters and SIGs to definitely look at how they can make their sites available over HTTPS. One of our key points we've always been focusing on is around encryption. It's one of our major projects now, and encrypting our websites, encrypting the connections to the websites is certainly critical to having an overall secure internet, secure website in some way. We do provide some instructions in the materials that you saw there around how to go and set up your Apache or Nginx servers to go and have just the support for TLS and TLS 1.2 and 1.3. I'm not necessarily going to walk them through here, but I'll say that this material is in the documentation that's there on GitHub. You could look at this and see how you can install this and work with it. For CDNs, very often you can just go and connect in and set up your certificates, and it will just go and work with those there. So those are pieces that are out there. I'll also mention that one of the interesting statistics we learned last year was that TLS 1.3, the newest version from 2018, actually provides 1.3 times faster performance in a large survey that Apple did for their Worldwide Developer Conference last year. They provided some stats around this. We've seen other similar stats from other providers, but basically the good news about encouraging people to use and supporting the latest version of TLS 1.3 is you'll actually get faster performance. Now, this is also a critical element for us as the Internet Society when we want to get our content out to people around the world, especially in areas that have limited or low bandwidth, who are just coming online, just getting connected to the internet. We want to make our website available to people wherever they may be on whatever kind of connections. For that, speed, performance, everything we can do is very helpful because it helps make it that much faster for people to connect there. So I want to just move on and talk about a couple of other elements around this. When you do that internet.nl test, you will find that there are some other things on there it says about cipher order and some things like this. What does that all mean? So one of the things they're trying to test is there's a variety of different ways that TLS can work. You can use different cryptographic ciphers, different encryption algorithms, basically, to go and make your website more secure. One of the things that you can do is configure your web server so that it prefers the most secure web ciphers. It prefers those first. And so we'll say that you need to go and do this. If you think about it, if it's in one way, if you speak multiple languages, if you speak English, French, Spanish, and those languages, but you're most comfortable in French, then your preferred language might be French. You want to say, I want to speak these languages in this order. Give me French first, because that's the one I'm best at, and then give me English and then Spanish or something like that. This is what you're doing. You're saying, I want to connect. I want to have connections happen in this order. Again, the documentation provides some specific ways you can do this. There are some ways that you can go in and say, I want to use things in this order. This is my preferred order. And you can configure those. The details are, again, in those pages at GitHub, but you're welcome. You can go and do that. CDNs, they don't really allow you to get down and muck around at this level. They usually do it there. But again, this is where you can raise support tickets for CDNs or for hosted providers and say, hey, can we get some help with this to make this as secure as possible? Sometimes when we've talked to hosting providers, they're just not even aware this is a thing, that they could make this more secure. And so we've sent them the OSI documentation. And we said, hey, how about, can you do this? And some have been very glad to do it because they've understood that, oh, that I can make this more secure for all my customers. They just don't know about that. Moving from TLS, there's another protocol called HSTS, which is what's called strict transport security. What this does is it really looks at, if I'm connecting over TLS to your website, to www.internetsociety.org, if I connect there, I want to talk TLS. I always want to talk TLS. I don't want to go to the unencrypted HTTP. I don't want to ever fall back to that. I only want to connect over TLS. What happens is you can use something called HSTS. It's a header, basically, that you can set that says, after you've connected here, you always will connect using TLS. Going back to my language metaphor, it's as if you got something that said, every time you talk to Dan York, you should speak in French. Now, I'll tell you, you probably don't want to do that with me, but just going along with it, right? If that was the order of languages, the preference, you would always want to connect with me. And every time you talk to me again, you would only speak to me in French. So that's the kind of thing you're saying. You're telling people and saying, always connect with us over a secure connection. It's actually a super simple change to make. You simply add like one line to the hosting files. It's very easy to go and do. But once you do this, you're guaranteeing that people will always connect to your server using TLS. This is what this HSTS is. And when you look at your internet.nl score, you will see in there whether or not you have that set. It's a very simple change to make. It does mean that you need to always use TLS, but it is there and something you can go and make a change at. I want to move from that to just another component, which is when you look at that internet.nl test, you may see a mention of something called security headers. There's, again, some ways that people don't know about how to go and configure their servers so that they're as secure as possible. Sergio had mentioned at the beginning W3C, who does a lot. So in the world of the internet, there are two major standards bodies that are involved in all of this. The Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, is the one that works with all of the lower level protocols and the connections that are between the browser and the server. And then the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, provides the standards for HTML and for some of the security headers and pieces that are used between the web servers and the browsers that are there. So with that, what happens with the security headers, what you can do is tell people that you want to use the highest level of security. We show some examples of some things for cross-site security protection, for different content types, for policy. These are some that we recommend. These are ones that Internet.nl recommends. These are ones that you can go and configure. Again, these are some details you can look at in the documentation and pieces that are there. But these are ways that you can go and configure to make it as secure as possible. The security headers we've mentioned here often just pass through a CDN. You should be fine with that. Some CDNs allow you to configure that if you use it. Some hosting providers will support this, or again, you need to contact them and work with that. I'll open it to questions before I go on in some other pieces. And I see we do have one. Why do we encourage self-SSL, which is ending up in misusages? Actually, we're not if we're using Let's Encrypt is, so what's being mentioned is with TLS, with using it, you can generate your own certificate. You can use a tool such as OpenSSL to go and create your own TLS certificate. You can put it on your website. You can work with it there. The problem, which the person mentioned here, is that a self-signed certificate doesn't necessarily have as much security as it's not connected into the global chain of trust. It doesn't have a linkage back to public key infrastructure it's used in the web. And so you get this warning that says, this is a self-signed certificate. Do you want to trust this site? And increasingly, browsers are making it harder to do that. That's actually a little different from what I was mentioning before. If you look at the site called Let's Encrypt, will generate a true, valid certificate that uses a root certificate that's built into all of the web browsers. And Let's Encrypt has had a phenomenal impact on securing the internet. Before Let's Encrypt came around, I think it was 2015, 2014, when I first really got underway. Before that, it was really hard to get an SSL connection set up. You had to go and work with an SSL certificate provider. It actually cost a good bit of money in many cases to go and do it. It was challenging. What Let's Encrypt did was make it so that you could get a globally valid certificate that would work, that was using a trusted root certificate, and you could get that for free. It's a free certificate you can install. There's code that will go and let you use it. We've seen a tremendous uptake. Now we're seeing upwards of 90% of all websites in many parts of the world are all using secure encrypted TLS. So it's a critical tool that we have. Let's Encrypt is a great provider for that. And so on your own server, you can go and use the appropriate software to install a Let's Encrypt certificate, and you can have a root certified type of TLS certificate. I hope that answered the question that you had there. So we actually don't encourage people to go and create their own self-certified certificates because, again, you get into this challenge that it will be less trusted by browsers and increasingly not trusted at all. Some of the newer versions of browsers make it very difficult to connect to a site without a valid certificate. Somebody else mentions that they deployed the guidelines on Internet.nl, and great, fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you did that. And the question that they asked was, can they contribute to the OSC documentation? Absolutely. It's on GitHub. You can go there and provide updates. There's an issue tracker there. If you're using GitHub, you can add an issue there. You can send a pull request. You can all of those things. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's okay too. But there are ways that you can work within GitHub to go and add things on there.
So the question was, by installing Let's Encrypt, do we have to automatically have DNSSEC?
So DNSSEC, or DNS security extensions, is a way to make sure that people are getting to your website and not to somebody else's website. We have a lot of resources around this available on our website. There's a lot of material out there in the OSC documentation that points to this, and you can see from there some of the information. One thing to know about DNSSEC is that it involves several different parts, and this is where it can get a little bit complicated to get this done. If you are registering your domain name, there's some changes you need to, it's hosted. You need to configure some pieces there to say, I want to have DNSSEC. And then your registrar, where you registered your domain name, needs to make a change that has to go up to your registry, which is the top level domain name. So like in the case of internetsociety.org, we have a registrar with whom we took that domain name out originally, we registered it. And then it has something that there is a registry for the .org top level domain that also takes some action. There's a couple of pieces that need to be done. We outlined some of those steps in the documentation. So there's a couple of different places where you can work with this. What happens is you sign your domain, you put up a cryptographic signature that says, these are in fact my records. These are the correct records. And then when I'm using it, when I go to connect that site, this is all happening before it even gets to the web browser. This is happening down at the system level. It's going and checking to see, is this the correct place to go? If it is, it will give you back the correct IP addresses to connect to, and you can go and do that. If it's not the correct information, you will not get a response. You won't be able to connect there. So this is something that you need to go and do. It involves a couple of steps. We have some pieces there that explain a bit more. Again, if you're hosting your own domain name and you're working with that, it can be fairly straightforward. If you're working with a content delivery network, they often don't need to get involved with this. Well, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Depends upon who's hosting a DNS. They often can make this very easy. The provider we're using right now, they'll just take care of that all for us and make those changes work really easily on that. With a hosting provider, sometimes they'll do that easily. Sometimes they need a little bit of extra cajoling to requesting to go and make that happen in some way. This has been all on the security side. I want to just talk about two other pieces that we encourage chapters to look at to make their sites as widely available as possible. One of these is IPv6. The Internet Society has obviously been working in this space for a very long time and trying to encourage that. To make this happen, you need to get IPv6 connectivity to wherever your website is hosted. Now, if you're working with a hosting provider, oftentimes all you can do is ask them and say, hey, when will you be able to have IPv6 connectivity? Those kind of things. As I mentioned earlier, I have a website hosted on an older provider that only has IPv4. They don't have any additional connectivity. This is another place that a content delivery network can provide you with a solution, because the CDN can make it so that you can go and get IPv6, even if your original web server only has IPv4. It's something that you can do. There's a good reason for this now, too. We're seeing that Apple has shown here again in their statistics that people were getting connections 1.4 times faster over IPv6. Making them available over IPv6 has been successful in helping people avoid some of the distributed denial of service attacks and other things that are out there, simply because of the fact that the address space is so much larger. The good news is, if you can get that connectivity at a basic level, then what happens is, from a website configuration, there's not necessarily much you need to do. This slide shows a command you can use to go and see, does your website currently have IPv6 connectivity? You can query for what's called a quad A, an AAAA record, and you can see, does it have this? If you've never used the dig command, this shows you how you can do it. The dig command is available on many Mac, Linux systems, other systems that are out there, and you can find it and work with it there at a command level in this way. Usually, Apache or Nginx, those things are already configured to work with this. There's not much you need to go and do. It's just often very simple. And again, most CDNs also provide IPv6 by default. It's a simple way to go and configure that in some way. Once your web server has that connectivity, you also need to add in this AAAA record. That's something you can just add into your DNS, and now your site will be able to be found over IPv6 and connect that way. Another one I want to just mention is something called HTTP2. And people may not be aware of this, but HTTP2 is the newest version of the HTTP protocol, and it was standardized by the IETF back in 2015. Many servers already support this, but we found, interestingly, that a lot of sites still didn't. But what it does is it allows you to have faster connections, faster setup times. It compresses things. It allows you to go and have a much faster connection there. As this chart shows, when Apple released these statistics last year, they found you almost got twice the speed in many cases of a faster connection. It's something that you can go and configure very easily in most cases. Sometimes you have to go in Apache's case, you have to configure a couple of things right in there. In Nginx, if that's what you're using for your website, you just simply have to add a text line into a file and restart the service. CDNs, most of them support it by default. A couple of them, you have to go and click a button on there. But this is HTTP2. It's a much faster protocol. It's out there in some way. And this is something we encourage chapters to look at and see if you aren't using HTTP2, can you configure this? It'll make your site, in most cases, that much faster. As I mentioned back at the beginning, HTTP3 is on its way to being standardized sometime this year, we hope. And then from there, that will take, again, probably a good number of years to flow out to all of the sites there. But in the meantime, this is a good one to go in and work with there. So we're at a point where I want to just wrap up and talk a bit about where you can go next and what's there. I asked the question here, how's your score? What was that? But it's something that you can look at. For the next steps, as part of this program here with the Internet Society Fundamentals, you will be asked to do one of the initiatives that are out there. And if you go to that site, if you go to there and to the catalog of things, you'll see there's 4 different things that we're asking you to do. One of them is using this documentation, improve the score of your chapter website or SIG website. You just make that better. That initiative on itself will help make the internet more secure. And being a chapter of the Internet Society, you'll be able to help us collectively make all of our websites more secure and lead by example and show the rest of the internet, this is how we can go and do it. There are 3 other initiatives you could do, advocating for the importance of these open standards and securing web servers, providing some mechanism to go and do that. We have some examples of things there. Conduct a training or webinar. You can use slides like these. We'll make them available that you can go and use these slides or a version like that and help encourage people in your area. We've seen some chapters do workshops where they've got together with people, businesses, others, organizations in their community, and gone and just had a session, whether it was a hackathon or whether it was just a time to get together where they helped each other work on their websites to go and find ways to make them work better in some way. Writing or publishing blog posts on your chapter website or in your local region, getting out to people in different ways, providing videos, doing screencasts, doing things like that. Any of those are ways that you can create an initiative. One example I'll give you last year was that the Internet Society Kolkata chapter in India, after the equivalent kind of training last year, their website was only scored 32% on the Internet.nl test. And a group of people there went together. They worked with their hosting provider. They worked with the folks who were there. They wound up taking their website all the way from 32% all the way up to 100% on the Internet.nl, showing a tremendous. And in fact, they were able to get it there faster than we could get some of our corporate websites to that level of compliance. So that was fantastic work that's out there. So you can read on our website a bit about what they did, and the pieces are there, and they're a tremendous example. And I would be honest to say, if any of you chapters do something like this, we'd like to hear about that as well. If you're able to move your site to that, we'd love to hear what you've done, what you've had to do. I will say some of our chapters were able to make some changes. In at least one case, they actually had to try to figure out how to move to a different web hosting provider. They had some issues with the one they were using anyway, and they decided to make a move. And when they were evaluating new web hosting providers, they looked at who would help them score the highest on this, have the most support for the standards and pieces that were there. Others were not able to make many changes. Sometimes they're either stuck in contracts with hosting providers or just don't have another option there that would allow them to go and work with it. So we're all trying to do as much as we can to move our sites to be as secure and available as possible. So there is a community in Connect. If you use the Connect platform that we have for open standards everywhere, you can join that. And I'll have a slide here with some more information about that. You're welcome to join in, post questions. There's other people there who have been implementing these pieces and working there. You can contact me directly. I'm York, Y-O-R-K, at isoc.org. Glad to entertain any kind of conversations. You can share this documentation in your region. You can also engage with us on GitHub, as was asked in a question that was earlier. It's an open project. Any of you can go and join in, work with that, do that. At some point when we're ready for it, we'd be open for chapters translating the content on those documents into other languages. We will be translating them into English, French, and Spanish, but we're open if somebody wanted to translate it into another language. That's something that a chapter could do to be able to advance it in the area that has that language. So that's what I've got to talk about. Again, there is a Connect forum that you're welcome to join, and the URL will be in these slides, but you can also just go into Connect if you work with that platform, connect.internetsociety.org, and you can log in and join that community there and see some of the past questions and post your own that are there. So we want open standards to be everywhere. We want to make our websites as secure as possible. And so with that, I will turn it open to questions. I see somebody ask a question about saying that their chapter didn't yet have a website. If you talk to your chapter coordinator, there are ways that you can work with that in some form. So there may be ways we can help you in some way. There are many sites out there that you can go and set your site up with in some way. One way that I encourage people is if you look at WordPress.com, it is a hosted service that provides hosted WordPress, so you don't have to take care of any of the kind of updates or things that are there. They have a free program that you can start out with as a way to go and do that. So you could, for instance, register a domain name if you have that, and you could start out with a free site there. The nice part about that is that at some future point, if you wish to go and start and have a larger presence, you can migrate your site from the hosted service to a self-hosted version of WordPress or a version on a hosting provider or something like that. And that's something to consider. There are any number of other hosting providers out there in some way that provide it. My one caution with you on that is when you're looking at hosting providers, just find out if you outgrow the hosting provider, can you export your content? Can you do something like that? Because some of them will lock you into their particular tools that they use. And so you've gone and you've built a website on their service, and then you want to do something differently. You want to put it in some other form, and you find that you can't easily take all of the content out of that website, that hosted service, and put it into something else. So if you are looking at hosted web hosts, just check to make sure that you're not locked into their proprietary tools, and that if you want to export your stuff, you can do so. Otherwise, you're in for a lot of copying and pasting, and that's not necessarily fun.
Thank you, Dan.
So my name is Willy Masharia from the University of Cape Town. My question is basically, are these open standard something that has been standardized, or is there any related document that has been approved by Internet Engineering Task Force that maybe we can look at and maybe it can help us?
Yes, all of these documents, all of these things that we've talked about here are formal standards, RFCs, requests for comments, that are approved by the Internet Engineering Task Force. If you go to the documentation that I mentioned on GitHub, if you go to any of those pages, the documents, down at the bottom of each of them, there's a set of resources, and it points to the specific RFCs, the request for comments, the internet standards that are for these specific standards. So all of these, whether it's TLS 1.3, the TLS security headers, any of these, there are very specific RFCs that you can go and see the actual standards for. Unfortunately, some of those standards don't necessarily help you understand how to deploy it. So that's where we've written some of this documentation to show people how to actually make it work. I see we have a question. How does open standards foster standards such as HIPAA for patient data encryption? Oh, we could go into a whole nother conversation, but basically, again, we're at that low level of making sure that we're securing the connections. And for the Internet Society in particular, we're really looking at how is the internet as secure as possible for the transmission of things like patient data. And so if that patient data is not traveling over an encrypted TLS kind of connection, then it is at risk. And so in that regard, these open standards and these security standards help support standards like HIPAA or other things around that. So these are building blocks in that larger security. Sergio asked the question of, are there specific guidelines regarding deploying streaming services and deploying Internet of Things? And the answer is, in this project, no. The ones we're focused on here are really around that connection that's there. Now, having said that, drop me a note. I'd be glad to talk to you about the security of some of those different pieces that you're talking about. As far as streaming services and pieces go, again, you're looking at how do you secure it with TLS? That's the kind of the critical piece. Does it work over HTTPS? Depending upon your streaming protocol, is it using a secure streaming protocol? And there's a number of those that are out there in some way. So that's a piece that's out there. And then deploying the Internet of Things piece, again, what we're looking at is how do we ensure those connections are happening over an encrypted connection using TLS? That's the key part there. If you want to drop me a message at york@isoc.org, I can point you to a couple of pieces that we have.
Sorry, I should just include here that my colleague from UCT asked the question of open standards. It must be realized that it is called open standards, but that does not mean that it's insecure. And I support the earlier speaker with the fact that we are only dealing with the fundamentals part right now. And that is end-to-end encryption.
Thank you. And yes, when I say open standards, these are the open standards in the sense that they are open to anyone to use. You don't have to pay a licensing fee to use these standards. They are open to anybody to read. There are some standards bodies out there that you have to actually pay to get a copy of the standard to implement it. They're open to anybody to go and read, to use. They're actually open to anybody to participate. Any of you here could actually be part of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF working groups. It's a mailing list. You can join and be part of that. You can help create these standards. And these open standards are the ones that power and secure the internet. They're how we're talking today. They're how we're working. It's how the internet works, is using these open internet standards. Using them, we all as Internet Society chapters and members can help to bring about a more secure internet that's available for everyone. I don't see more questions, but I would just say thank you to all of you for attending, for being interested in doing this work. I hope that you will go and do some strong initiatives to go and get more security and more availability out there. If you're interested, please feel free to contact me. I'm very glad to help you all and provide you with pointers to information that we have out there. As I mentioned earlier, there is this community in Connect where people can join and ask questions of your peers and other members of the Internet Society community. And together we can help make this all more secure and available.